Hello and welcome to RootsDiscovery.com. I'm your host, Mick. Today we crack the case of the Riordon brothers of Pokeshaw, Gloucester, New Brunswick. Now, for a brief history of the Riordon family, I turn you over to descendant Mary Ann Riordon Barry.
Hi, my name is Mary Ann Riordon Barry. I grew up in a small community called Pokeshaw in the civil parish of New Bandon, County of Gloucester, New Brunswick, Canada. I was always curious as to where our ancestors came from in Ireland. My dad, Guy Riordon Sr., instilled in our big family a love of everything Irish. A relative, Judy Barry, did huge amounts of research on families that immigrated to the Chaleur Bay region, and through her I became connected with Mick in Philadelphia. Mick did loads of research for me. He was always professional, and he opened my eyes to numerous records and logical deductions that I had missed in my 30 years of dabbling in genealogy. It was confusing and time-consuming. He remained patient, keen, and focused through all of our communications. The Riordons arrived around 1819, maybe from the Bandon area of County Cork. They were Roman Catholic, and they settled in Pokeshaw, named for its Mi'kmaq seasonal settlers of bygone days. The name means where the waters narrow, meaning that Passbibiac in Quebec, Gaspé, and Pokeshaw have the narrowest stretch of water across the Baie des Chaleurs. Pokeshaw sits between the communities of New Bandon, Protestant Irish, and Grand-Anse, Catholic French Acadians. The first settlers in Grand-Anse came in 1809, after the Acadians were expelled from Nova Scotia. Black Rock is a sister community with Pokeshaw, 2 miles inland. My mom, Bernadine Welton, grew up there. Waterloo was settled by Irish Catholics on the eastern side of Grand-Anse. At what time? You guessed it, the end of the Battle of Waterloo. Lobster Beach was next door to Waterloo. Our families helped build and form the Catholic Church of St. Simon St. Jude in Grand-Anse. Mission churches took our records to the church in Caracat before we built our own church. Some family sacraments happened at Holy Family Church in Bathurst, Sainte Famille. Censuses for our area are only available from 1861 onward. Family rumor says that 3 Riordon brothers arrived with an uncle, a Crowley. Now, let Mick walk you through our past. Where did these Riordons come from in Ireland?
Let's reiterate, the family folklore is that 3 brothers, John, Patrick, and James Riordon, arrived with an uncle named Crowley, circa 1819. Now what this record shows is the 1833 petitioning for debt forgiveness for the land held by these Irish Catholics in the Crown lands of New Bandon. What we can see here is that Patrick Riordon is married, has 4 children, and has had possession of this land for 8 years, which is 200 acres. What is known about the 3 Riordon brothers and their wives? John Riordon married Johanna Leahy. Patrick Riordon married Catherine. I have since found out her name was Catherine Hanley. James Riordon married Margaret Butler. This is the marriage record for Patrick Riordon and his wife Catherine Hanley. This image is very blurry, so the only thing we should pay attention to here is the arrow at the bottom, which shows that the witness to the wedding was a Dennis Crowley. So is this perhaps the uncle known to have come over with Patrick? From that previous slide, we learned that on the 16th of January, 1826, Patrick Riordon marries Catherine Hanley at Grand-Anse, New Bandon. The witnesses are Dennis Crowley, possibly the uncle, and Joseph Coombs. This is another image that I'm going to transcribe on the next slide. What we can see here, though, is that Richard Tyner of County Cork marries Marie Poulin of Grandance. If we look at the bottom again, we can see with the arrow that Dennis Crowley is the witness, and this is in the year of 1822. From the 4th of November 1822, Richard Tyner of County Cork marries Marie Poulin of Grandance, New Bandon. The witnesses, once again, we have a Dennis Crowley. Now, this shows us that in 1822, Dennis Crowley is indeed within the parish of Grandance. So we should pay attention to that timeline. This is a marriage record from 1821. Now, before I transcribe that on the next image, I would like you to look at the very bottom where it shows that a witness is John Riordon. On the 29th of August, 1821, Lawrence Geehan marries Mary White, both of Ireland, at Grandance. The witnesses are John Sullivan and John Riordon. So what this shows is that in 1821, John Riordon was indeed within the parish of Grandance. This is a very blurry image from 1835. This consists of a marriage between a James Ryan and a Margaret Boulter or Butler. I'm going to zoom in on this image and see if we can figure out what it says. What we're looking at here again is the marriage between a James, what appears to be Ryan, and a Margaret, what I think is actually Butler. Well, if we remember, James Riordon is said to have married a Margaret Butler. Now, we could dismiss this record because I don't see Riordon here, I see a Ryan. However, look at the parents' names of this supposed James Ryan. We see a Patrick, but then we look at the mother's maiden name and it says Crowley. This is obviously the surname of Crowley. And if we remember, Patrick Riordon came over with an uncle named Crowley, who I think now is Dennis Crowley. Is this Johanna Crowley the sister of the uncle named Dennis Crowley, which would then explain why he was called an uncle to Patrick Riordon? I've transcribed that blurry image that we saw in that last slide. On the 28th of November, 1835, James Riordon, written as Ryan, son of Patrick Riordon and Johanna Crowley, marries Margaret Butler, daughter of James Butler and Margaret Driscoll. Well, this contradicts what I'm trying to point out, that James Riordon was the actual person marrying Margaret Butler. This is from the Provincial Archives. However, I still say that this is incorrect. It states that James Ryan is of the parish of Beresford in the county of Gloucester. So this would have been just to the north of Bathurst. But this Margaret Butler, daughter of James Butler and Margaret Driscoll, did marry a James Riordon. So we have a problem here. So I'm going to need more proof to prove that this James Ryan was not James Ryan, it was James Riordon. This is the 1861 census of New Bandon. This is the family of Thomas Butler and his wife Mary. What I notice is that he has a Catherine Riordon called a niece living with him that is 12 years old. So if Margaret Butler married a James Riordon and was the daughter of James Butler and Margaret Driscoll, can I perhaps link this Thomas Butler to Margaret to prove that we're dealing with the same family? And can we also prove that that Catherine Riordon then is the daughter of James Riordon and his wife, Margaret Butler? Here we have proof that Thomas Butler was in fact the brother of Margaret Riordon. This baptism took place on the 3rd of October in 1843. Thomas Butler, aged 9, was baptized at St. Famille in Bathurst, son of James Butler and Margaret Driscoll. These are the same parents that are listed as the parents of Margaret Butler when she was married to James Riordon. We've already seen this image. This is the image of the marriage between James Riordon and Margaret Butler from 1835. I'm just using this to emphasize that the parents listed for Margaret Butler, James Butler, and Margaret Driscoll match Thomas Butler's baptism at St. Famille in 1843 when he was 9 years old. So, the Catherine Riordon was most definitely the daughter of James Riordon and Margaret Butler listed in the 1861 census from New Bandon. This is the 1861 census of New Bandon showing James Riordon and his wife Margaret Butler. What we're not seeing is the oldest daughter that can be seen in the 1861 census, which is Catherine, and she is living with Uncle Thomas Butler. These are the rest of the children, James, Daniel, Michael, and Charles. Now, even if we throw in that Catherine was 12 years old, we still have a 13 or 14-year gap between the time of the marriage of these two individuals and the birth of their first known daughter. So then the obvious question then would be, where are the older children? Did they die in infancy? Or could there be another explanation? Could it be that they had daughters that had married into other families that can simply not be seen in the 1861 census, since they would be under their husbands' names? This we don't know. There are no facts to show that that could be the case, but it just leaves a question mark since we have a big gap between the marriage and the first known child, Catherine, who was 12 years old in 1861. Now let's play devil's advocate here. Is it possible that Margaret Butler had been married previously to a James Ryan? Well, this is not something that was known to have happened. We also would have to then swallow that this James Ryan just happened to have a mother named Johanna, and of all surnames, Crowley. This seems very unlikely. We do have the issue, again, of the children being born much later than what would be expected given that they were married in 1835. But as stated before, it could be that perhaps they had females that were married into other families, or it could just be as simple as their earlier children died during infancy. This piece of information might lend itself to the idea that, in fact, a Crowley, an uncle, came over with the Riordons. Here we have John Riordon and his wife Johanna Leahy living right next door to Patrick Crowley, who was most likely the cousin of John Riordon and his two brothers, Patrick and James. This is a marriage record for James Salter. He was a neighbor of Patrick Riordon, and this took place on the 9th of November, 1827 at Caraquet. What we see here is that James Salter states his father is John Salter and his mother is Margaret Crowley. Now this can't be a coincidence given that he is living next to the Riordons, who state that their mother was also a Crowley. But more significant than that is perhaps what is found on the right-hand side of the screen. Where was James Salter from? It says Dunmanway. This is the marriage record for the brother of the previous James we had just looked at. This is for Thomas Salter. This was his marriage on the 4th of September, 1826. What we see here is that he is stating that his father is John Salter and his mother is Margaret Crowley. But here we're looking at his wife. His wife was Helen Crowley, daughter of Dennis Crowley and Helen Hurley. Now I'm wondering here, is this a case of cousins intermarrying? We were given a reference of Dunmanway for James Salter. What is my curiosity with James Salter? Well, if we look at James Salter, his positioning on that petition for land debt forgiveness in 1833 shows that he was a neighbor, a direct neighbor, to Patrick Riordon. More significant than that, his mother is listed as a Crowley, Margaret Crowley. Are we dealing with cousins? Are the Riordons then not only related to the Crowleys, but is it possible they're related to the Salters? So what we could do is we could try and find whether or not the Crowleys and Riordons are from the Dunmanway area as stated for the Salters. So what I did was I went and looked for any evidence of the family of Dennis Crowley and his known wife of Ellen Hurley in Dunmanway. Here on the 5th of December, 1818, we have a son named Dennis. He is from the town of Silahurtane in Dunmanway. So then the obvious thing to do next is to prove that this Dennis actually existed in the parish of New Bandon. In order for us to establish that indeed the Crowleys were from Silahurtane, we need to find that Dennis that was baptized in 1818 in the parish of New Bandon. Well, I looked in the 1861 census and I cannot find a Dennis Crowley that was around that age in the 1861 census. So what I did was I looked back at the marriage records that were previous to that, and I did find a Dennis Crowley that was married on the 18th of November, 1847. He married Margaret Coombs. His brother, Patrick Crowley, married Mary Coombs, and that Patrick is here as his best man. On the 18th of November, 1847, Dennis Crowley marries Margaret Coombs at Grand Anse, with the witnesses being Patrick Crowley and Raphael Blanchard. A little backstory on Patrick Crowley is he was known to have married Mary Coombs. So perhaps this is the case of two brothers marrying two sisters. This is the tombstone of Mary Crowley. It shows that she was Mary Coombs and was the wife of Patrick Crowley. Here once again is a 1833 land petition document. What this shows is that Patrick Riordon is wedged in between Joseph Coombs and James Salter. Well, we know that James Salter was from Dunmanway, so one has to wonder whether or not Patrick Riordon is from Dunmanway as well. However, when I looked up Joseph Coombs, I found that he was one of the very few people living in New Bandon that was from the actual parish of Bandon, County Cork. This is a small area of southern County Cork, and what this represents is the actual area where many of the inhabitants of New Bandon came from in this portion of County Cork. What we see on the right is Bandon. I pointed an arrow to that because this is where Joseph Coombs came from. He was one of the few that I found actually coming from Bandon, County Cork. On the left, I point out Dunmanway. This is where I found the Salters and the Crowleys, and possibly the Riordons are from there as well. This marriage took place at New Bandon in 1849. Tim McCarthy, the husband, is coming from Stanley, York. This is about 250 kilometers or 150 miles to the southwest of New Bandon. The obvious question is, how did these people meet? Well, we can give up on that question and say it'll never be answered, or we can perhaps try and figure out another explanation which would explain why this marriage took place. So I will transcribe that last record. On the 23rd of July, 1849, Tim McCarthy of Stanley, York, New Brunswick, marries Mary Riordon of New Bandon. The witnesses were Dan Foley and Johanna Crowley. I'm using this map just to illustrate the long distance Tim McCarthy had to travel to Grandance to marry Mary Riordon. Again, we have to ask ourselves, how did these two meet? There is such a distance in between these two parishes. How would a farm laborer down in Stanley, who's probably going to inherit his father's farm, find this woman in Grandance? I do not think these people just happened to meet somewhere in between and just suddenly decided to get married. I think there's something more at play here. What I did was I looked at the 1851 census for Stanley, York. What I found was that Tim and his wife Mary Riordon were living there with his father Michael and mother Julia. So what I did was I was able to find out through other records that his mother's actual name was Julia Nyhan. Here is his actual baptism, which took place on the 25th of July, 1819. What we can see on the right is the town he came from. That town is Currabeg. But what is the parish we're looking at here? We're looking at, once again, Dunmanway. Why am I focused on this Tim McCarthy? What is his significance to the Riordon family? At first glance, nothing. He would have nothing to do with the Riordons up in New Bandon. He just happens to marry into that family. But the problem here is the distance this Tim McCarthy has to travel. Given the times, how did he meet Mary Riordon? What I am thinking here is this family here, the McCarthys, arranged for their son Tim to marry Mary Riordon, and perhaps Mary Riordon's parents arranged for her to marry Tim McCarthy. What do we have thus far? Three brothers, John, Patrick, and James Riordon, arrived with their uncle Crowley circa 1819. This uncle turned out to be Dennis Crowley. We later learned that this James listed his parents as Patrick Riordon and Johanna Crowley, indicating that Dennis Crowley was a brother of their mother, Johanna. Dennis Crowley and his wife, Ellen Hurley, were located in the town of Silla-Hurtane, Dunmanway, County Cork. This Dennis was even a witness to nephew Patrick's wedding in 1826. Another individual, James Salter, and neighbor to Patrick Riordon, states he too is from Dunmanway, and that his mother is Margaret Crowley. Incidentally, a Tim McCarthy of Stanley, York, marries into the Riordon family, and he was baptized at Dunmanway. So this is probably a case of an arranged marriage. Perhaps the McCarthys were associated with the Riordons in Ireland. So what is the conclusion that we would reach at this point? 2, possibly 3 related families from the area of Dunmanway, County Cork, Ireland, the Riordons, Crowleys, and Salters, helped establish a community of Irish Catholics in New Bandon, Northumberland, which is now Gloucester, New Brunswick, during the early 1820s. While the Riordons and Crowleys were stated to be relatives, it is unknown whether the Salters are kin. However, it looks very strong that they were in fact all three kin to one another. Other than a reference for County Cork for the origins of the Riordons, we do not have any knowledge as to where they actually came from in County Cork, whether that is the parish or the town. Let's look at the neighbor, James Salter. James Salter stated he was from Dunmanway. Why would we be looking at James Salter, though, if we're really looking for the Riordons? But it's his mother's maiden name that is key here, Crowley. Her name was Margaret Crowley. And let's remember, an uncle who turned out to be Dennis Crowley came over with Patrick Riordon. But why James Salter again? James Salter was the neighbor of Patrick Riordon. What are the odds that the Riordons are going to be offspring of a Johanna Crowley and their neighbor next door, a Salter, who just happens to have a mother named Margaret Crowley, are not going to be related? Especially when you consider what a small population of people we're dealing with. They are setting up a new community here. And here you have two Crowleys on the maternal line. But then you also have the uncle, Dennis Crowley, and his wife, Ellen Hurley, who I then found in Scylla Hurtane, Dunmanway. So the conclusion from that alone would suggest that the Riordon brothers were from Dunmanway, County Cork. So what have we learned? Well, we know that the Salters were from Dunmanway. They stated this. We found the Crowleys living in Dunmanway in a town called Scylla Hurtane. When we found the McCarthy baptisms, we found that their town was Currabeg, just over the border from Dunmanway in Enniskeen. When I looked more closely at Dunmanway, I was looking for Salters. I found no instances of Salters having any baptisms, but I did see some of them sponsoring for other families. And the area that I found them was at that town to the north there called Derry Nasafa. So what you have then are three families, all known to be affiliated with the Riordons, in Ireland in a very small area. So what you're looking at here is the approximate area of where the Riordons came from in Ireland. If you would like help in finding your Irish roots, please visit me at rootsdiscovery.com. My email is rootsdiscoverycontact@gmail.com. This has been your host, Mick, and I just cracked the case.